Thank you very much. Distinguished participants, dear colleagues, and fellow panelists. I would like to start by thanking the Portuguese Platform for Women's Rights Organization for the invitation to speak to you all here today. I'm very happy to be here and share some of the Swedish experience to address sexual exploitation in prostitution and the purchase of sexual services and trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, which we have done for more than 20 years now, since 1999, that we've heard from previous speakers. I think we cannot, as we also heard from previous speakers, we cannot talk about prostitution without talking about trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation. We see that these two phenomena are inextricably linked. Prostitution is exploitation in itself, but we also see that so many people in prostitution are also victims of trafficking today. And it is unfortunately clear from recent reports that we're not doing enough to address trafficking for sexual exploitation. Data from the UN as well as the EU show us that trafficking has further increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has put women and children in even more vulnerable situations. And unfortunately, traffickers have also adapted their modus and recruited vulnerable children and women from the increasing social risk groups in society. And we also see that it's been more difficult for victims to actually get access to social services and also access to justice in general due to the fact that our societies have been closed. And to counter this problem and to prevent further exploitation, we need to take a whole of society approach to make sure that we're working closely with prevention and all the mechanisms that we have in place to address this phenomena. And for Sweden, we see that we need to address the demand, and we need to have a gender-sensitive approach and also gender-sensitive legislation. We also need to address the fact that we have trafficking, we have prostitution in society due to the fact that someone is paying for it, due to the fact that the demand, the buyers of sexual services is also a part of the chain of the whole exploitation. They contribute to trafficking of victims. And as you are aware, the work against prostitution and trafficking for sexual exploitation is a high priority for the Swedish government. And it's included in the national strategy to address men's violence against women. So it's clear that prostitution in itself is a form of men's violence against women. And the ban of the purchase of sexual services is, of course, central in all these efforts. It's been illegal since 1999 to buy sexual services in Sweden. Sweden was then the first country in the world to criminalize the purchase, but not the sale of sex, which is very important, that people in prostitution are not criminalized in any way. They have the right to exit programs, etc. And also, of course, all forms of procuring are illegal in Sweden. So Sweden has an abolitionist approach to prostitution. And the Swedish view is that prostitution itself causes harm to both the individuals involved, but also to society at large, which we've heard here earlier on this morning. And not least, that it affects gender equality negatively. Prostitution and trafficking in human beings for sexual exploitation are, as you are aware, highly gendered issues. Men are the predominant purchasers of sexual services, users of victims of trafficking, whether that service is provided by women, girls, LGBTI people, men or boys. And most people in prostitution are women, and increasingly more also we see girls being recruited at a young age into prostitution. By exclusively targeting demand, Sweden aims at disrupting the market, while at the same time also equalizing an inherited power imbalance between men and women. And exploitation in prostitution cannot be seen as work. Buying sex is a violent act in itself. And so it's clear that we cannot legalizing. We also see that we also heard from previous speakers, the countries who have legalized prostitution also see a high level of violence against people in prostitution. Prostitution itself is violence by definition of the Swedish government. But of course, the Swedish legislation was not developed in a vacuum. It stemmed over decades of movement within the women's movement and discussions on women's rights and equality in general in society. And as we've heard, several other countries have followed suit, including our neighboring countries such as Ireland and Norway, but also Iceland and Norway, and Ireland, Northern Ireland, Canada, and of course Israel, and also France. And just a few words, and also the fact that it was first called the Swedish model, then became the Nordic model, and now we're more and more talking about the equality model, which of course is a development that we highly welcome. And given our similar approach to these issues, we're working closely with France. We're implementing a joint diplomatic strategy to end all forms of sexual exploitation of women and girls and in prostitution, and to address trafficking for sexual exploitation. And we are working jointly together with our embassies to implement different sort of seminars and awareness raising in society, and we're also working within the UN system and towards the EU as well on our joint strategy. Legislation is of course a clear signal that also often has a normative effect, and we have seen that street prostitution has gone down in Sweden, and also the demand for prostitution. And Sweden has become a less attractive market for traffickers due to the fact that there is no it's not as easy to traffic people into Sweden as there is not an open market in that sense. And we also see that our legislation has had the normative effect in society, and plus 70% of the Swedish population supports the legislation. But having said this, at the same time, availability has increased in Sweden just as it has done in any other country due to the access or the online recruitment of victims, and also ads being out on the internet. And we see new phenomena in Sweden such as sugar dating, as we see in any other countries. And these are phenomena that of course risk to normalize prostitution in society. And it requires a different type of outreach work for both the law enforcement of the side of the social services. And it also further clear that a ban on the purchase of sexual services is not enough. We need to work with changing norms in society, and a ban can of course also only be a complement to social efforts. This is a social problem as much as it is a criminal problem. And in this, impact assessments are of course very important. The Swedish law has been evaluated a few times, and we've seen that it has had a positive normative effect in society, and also that people in prostitution feel that the legislation is on their side, and it's been easier for them to sort of access the authorities and feel that they could exit prostitution. But we're also now looking into, for example, just to mention that the Swedish Crime Prevention Authority is currently looking into how the legislation is being used by prosecutors, police, and the social services, and how the social services and the law enforcement interacts jointly. Also, having said that, in Sweden it's the social services in the municipalities. We have 290 municipalities in Sweden, and they all are responsible for providing assistance to people in prostitution as well as victims of trafficking. We also have something that is called regional coordinators against the prostitution that works closely, that is jointly working with the law enforcement and the social services in order to provide assistance to victims. Just a few more words about prevention and changing norms and attitudes in society. In order to counteract the long-term demand for the purchase of sexual services, we see a need for universal prevention measures aimed at boys and young men, as well as efforts to change harmful norms in society that justifies harmful norms and stereotypes, and also restrict women and girls' scope for action and life choices. And we also need to work with the demand, and in Sweden it's also the buyers of sexual services who wants to stop this behavior can on a voluntary basis also be offered social support and therapy by the municipalities. And also just to mention, we heard the issue of consent here earlier. In Sweden since 2018, a new sexual offences legislation was introduced that is based on consent, meaning that it's now an offence to perform a sexual act with someone who is not participating voluntarily. And we see this is a very important step towards preventing abuse and ensuring bodily integrity. And we've put that in relation to prostitution and trafficking. This means that this legislation, if anyone buys sex from a person who has been trafficked, they can also be convicted of rape or negligent rape. We also heard earlier, comprehensive sexuality education is very important when it comes to addressing gender-based violence. It shows us that this has positive normative effect on young boys and girls, and the Swedish government has recently decided to change the school curricula in Swedish schools to equip boys and girls with an understanding that sex must be based on consent and free will. And also discussion of pornography will of course also be included in this curricula in schools. But it's clear that we all need to do much more to address this phenomena, and I think no matter what the national legislations are, all member states of the UN, as well as the Council of Europe Convention and the EU, have an obligation to address the demand that fosters trafficking for all forms of exploitation, no matter if this is done via legislation or by other means. And it's positive to see that we do see an increased attention on working to address the demand. We've seen it within the cooperation within the OSCE, for example, where Sweden also has the current presidency in 2021, and the EU new strategy also talks more about the member states' responsibility to address the demand. But it's clear that we need to disrupt this business model that is based on exploitation and find efficient mechanisms to do so. And we need solid cooperation models, and it's clear that in that we also need to listen to people with experience of exploitation, people who have been in prostitution, survived prostitution, and Sweden founded the establishment of the ODIHR ISTAC, the Advisors Council of People of Survivors of Trafficking, which is very important that we listen to the experience and also include them in the policy work for the future. And it's clear that all the cooperation models are needed, and that demand needs to be a part of this equation. Thank you.